Good morning, everybody. So this is the third lesson in a series of 3 lessons about the nature of popular support for Hitler and the Nazi movement. Just give you the big picture, okay, so you can sort of see how this was all playing out and fitting together. So obviously there's been a big focus on the Nazi regime since the start of Depth Study 3. Depth Study 3 focusing on the first 3 years of the Nazi regime, called the New Reich, 1933 to 35. And then we have broadened out now because we're now moving into the into the breadth study, okay, because moving away from the depth study into the breadth study, which means that we're extending our understanding of Nazism, looking at the whole of the Nazi period from 1933 to 1945. Okay, 3 lessons for this particular topic, and this is the third of those 3 lessons. Okay, so there are the 3 lessons. So we've looked at, first of all, the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft, and then in our last lesson we looked at Hitler's personal popularity and some broader issues about the nature of support, positive and negative, for the Nazi regime. And this lesson was looking specifically at the attitudes of different sectors of the population towards the Nazi regime. Okay, so that was our first lesson in a nutshell, the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. Just a reminder of what we covered in that lesson. Again, you can pause the video and just have a quick read through that just to get it back into your head. And then the second lesson about Hitler's popularity and the nature of support for the Nazi regime is we started this big mind map that we're working on at the moment and that we're finishing off today. Okay, so those are the 3 strands that we looked at last lesson about Hitler's popularity. Again, you can pause that and read that if you want a quick recap. And what we're doing today then is we're finishing off this mind map by looking at the specific social groups, the middle classes, the working classes, women, back to the army, we've covered that a lot recently, and religious groups. Now, when we started this sort of like larger topic in our first lesson, I took you through how the content here can actually be assessed in all 3 sections of the exam paper. What we're doing today, looking at the social classes, is of a special relevance for section C, the breadth study of society. Okay, and now, as you know, that particular section, you are given an essay question and you are asked to write an answer that covers all 120 years. Okay, so if you have a quick look at that, you can clearly see whichever question you're looking at, they always say 1871 to 1990. And there's a range of different questions here, from the revision guides and from the specimen papers and from an actual live paper in 2018. Okay, for you to look at. They all cover the whole 120 years. And that's what you're required to do. In 45 minutes in the exam, section C, you've got to write an answer, okay? And you've got 2 to choose from, okay? You've got to answer one of those 2. And as a general rule, one of them is a question that focuses on the development of the German economy, 1871 to 1990, and the other one is a question that looks at the development of German society between 1871 and 1990. Okay, so what we're doing here, because this is about society between 1933 and 1945, we're putting another piece of the jigsaw puzzle together. So we've already covered society up to 1932, so we're now picking it up 1933 to 45. Okay, and as you can see, the type of questions that you tend to get, or that you can get, looking at a range of the questions here, is often they do focus in on particular groups of Germans, okay? And you've got to write for about that particular group of Germans over the 120-year period. So look at the first one there, about the position of women, okay? Here you've got one about the urban working class. Not the next one, because that's about social mobility. That's more of a broader one. But again, you've got another one there about the urban working class. And the second specimen paper was about the landowning elites. And then in the 2018 paper, you've got one about the white collar workers. Okay. And there are other groups you could, there could be a question, for example, in the 2021 paper, who knows, about the artisans and the Mittelstand. That hasn't been tested before. So that's the sort of like focus, okay, that you tend to get in section C of the paper. Now, clearly, logically, if you're writing for 45 minutes and you've got to cover 120 years, and I'll do more about this at a later stage as the exam approaches, how do you structure answers to section C? And the general rule of thumb is a sort of like an analytical narrative. So broadly speaking, your paragraphs would be in chronological order. So you'd begin by answering the question with regards to the Second Reich, 1871 to 1918. Then your next paragraph would be with regards the Weimar Republic, 1919 to 1932, and so on. Okay, but we'll look at that at a later stage. Now, broadly speaking, therefore, what this means by implication is at the middle point of the essay you will want to move into the Nazi era, 1933 to 45. But because you've got to cover the whole 120 years in the exam paper, when you actually write about the Nazi era, you're probably not going to be able or have time to write more than one or possibly maximum 2 paragraphs on whatever you're going to write about. Okay, so take that example of that first question there about the position of women. You've got to write about over a whole 120 years. You've got to talk about the position of women in Nazi Germany, 1933 to 45, at some point in the answer, but it will be just one part of your answer. So probably in the end, this is why they call it a breadth study rather than a depth study. You haven't got that time to go into that much detail. You just need to know and understand what are the key points, the key trends, for that specific era. So if you talk about the Nazi era, what are the key points? And because it's a breadth study, be able to point out similarities and differences with what went before and what's going to come afterwards. Look for those sort of common trends, those big themes over time. So that's the general approach. So don't worry too much about the detail is what I'm saying here. I'm going to in this lesson. Okay, the important bit really is the sort of like the in a nutshell really, and there is detail that I'll ask you to pick up, and obviously that deepens your understanding, but be mindful of the fact you're not going to be writing a whole essay on women in Nazi Germany. It simply is not the case. The paper requires you to talk about it briefly within a bigger essay that covers 120 years. Before we start then, just a quick reminder about the reading. Okay, the big focus has been on chapter 6, and in particular, all 3 lessons have been making use of that first essay. Hopefully by now you've actually read it, okay? If you haven't, you really do need to read it. The scan is there in Padlet. Don't just rely on my notes and my YouTube. You've got to be reading these essays yourself. That's how you learn. You internalise how good historians write, and that's what you've got to be doing. You've got to be writing like good historians. There's got to be a natural flow, the language you use, the sort of like the precision of your vocabulary. That you will develop that if you read historians, okay? If all you do is read the textbook and rely on my notes, you will never really learn how to write like a historian, and that's a big factor. You're in the A-level, you're assessed on how well you write as well as what you're writing about, so that's important. Read a little bit regularly. You've got to be reading historians. And talking about great history, the 4-volume series edited by Jeremy Noakes and Geoffrey Pridham. It's a classic. It's a documentary reader, but it's got great sort of like introductions to each chapter and great commentary between the documents, and the documents themselves are absolutely fascinating. So hopefully you're sort of engaging with this book, and this is one of the best chapters in all 4 volumes, called The Regime and the People. And the beauty of it is it's quite a short chapter. There aren't that many documents in it. The documents that are in there are very good, but it primarily focusing on what Noakes and Pridham say in their own writing. And to help you with that, remember, I've recorded a YouTube video in which I walk and talk you through my own notes to that. But the same principle applies. Go to the original chapter and read that. That is important. I've uploaded a scan of that chapter for you, which you can download from the Padlet area and from Teams. Okay, so we're ready to start. Okay, so we're finishing off this mind map. We've done the first 3 strands in the last lesson. Now this lesson with the specific social classes. Now, this opening slide, don't worry about mind mapping it. This is just simply by means of an introduction. Okay, so there's no strand on the mind map for you to do anything here. But the point just to make is this, okay, that interpretations of history change over time. It's what we call historiography, the history of the history books. Okay, and we've talked about this a lot during this course. And obviously the reason they change is because new evidence gradually appears over time. So when World War II ended in 1945, the first round of history books written in the late 40s and 1950s had a point of view because they were based on what historians knew about Nazi Germany from the evidence available at that time. But then more evidence began to appear in the 1960s. Okay, archives were opened and historians had time to read about the period, and they began to change their views. Okay, they began to realise that to a large extent the first history books written in the 50s the historians were influenced by their perception of what they of the public image that the regime had produced about themselves at the actual time. Goebbels' propaganda machine had wanted to create a public image of efficiency and strong leadership, etc., and unity. And by the 1960s, historians were beginning to realise, remember, that it was not quite as efficient, it wasn't quite as united, and even issues such as Hitler being a strong leader were now subject to question. Was he really? He seemed to be a weak dictator and so on. So we've seen how that's changed over time. And it continues to change. I mean, when the Cold War ended in 1990, Western historians had access to a lot more historical evidence because, of course, the eastern half of Germany between 1949 and 1990 was subject to Soviet control, and the Soviets did not release historical archives to the West during this period. And after 1990, again, more and more evidence appeared. Okay, so what are we saying here? Older interpretations, the first interpretations about society in Nazi Germany, tended to sort of produce stereotypes. Okay, it's rather simplistic caricatures. Okay, and that was largely sort of, to some extent, sort of like driven by what the Nazis claimed themselves in their propaganda and so on, their newsreels, and it was far too simplistic. And since the 1950s, a lot of what we call bottom-up historical research, in other words, historians have really looked at the archives of ordinary Germans. Okay, they looked at the letters and diaries written by ordinary Germans. They've been less focused in on Nazi policies towards the different social groups, but more on looking at what the ordinary Germans had got to say and the behaviours of ordinary Germans. And as a result of that, there's been a modification. Okay, so I just want to start it off here by just making sure you're fairly clear about what the old views were, the outdated views were. Okay, because that's our starting point, and then what we'll do in this lesson is we'll look at how, in a sense, these old views are outdated. So the old view was that the upper and middle classes were seen to be the most enthusiastic supporters of the regime because they brought Hitler to power in the first place. Okay, so rather simplistic. This view has not been completely debunked. It's still an important thing, but our understanding now is much more rounded and much more subtle. Another view, the working class were very much seen to be oppressed. the resistors of Nazism, because of course the SPD and the KPD had been crushed, the trade unions likewise abolished, etc. Okay, that's an old interpretation. Likewise, women were seen to be very much repressed but compliant. Okay, just did as they told, but the Nazi regime was the world of men. Okay, and women were just forced into the home. The army traditionally was seen to be split between some members of the German army were passionate Nazi supporters. They had put Hitler into power. But then there was a layer of Prussian higher officers who barely concealed their contempt for Nazism, okay? And they became the opponents and they plotted to kill Hitler during World War II. And the churches, the religious groups, were sort of like unsettled and disturbed by the manner of Hitler's takeover of power. They supported it at first, but they began to regret the fact they had supported him. Okay, sort of fairly sort of simplistic interpretations. Now, I'm not saying that these interpretations are wrong. I'm saying that they have become more refined and more developed over the decades since the end of World War II. Let's go into these different interpretations, and we'll start with the middle classes. Okay, so in a nutshell, traditionally seen as the most enthusiastic supporters of the regime because they largely supported the Nazis into power in 1933. So many middle classes continued to support the Nazis after 1933 because the Nazi policies personally benefited them. Now remember, middle classes contains a wide range of people, okay? It can go from the small shopkeeper, okay, or the craft worker, anybody who owns their own business, all the way up to Thyssen, for example, huge industrialists who own massive industrial cartels. They're all middle class. And it also includes sort of educated professional workers, okay, lawyers, bankers, etc. So it's a big group of middle classes, but generally seen as the most enthusiastic. And of course, Nazi policies did benefit them, okay, the economic recovery, etc., to a point. But it is more refined than that because the middle classes' view of the Nazi regime, there were some middle classes who supported the regime in the early years but didn't benefit, and so their views actually changed. So it's a big time period, 1933 to 45, and what we're saying is that the attitudes shifted over time. Okay, so we just need to be more refined in understanding. And as you can see, the mind map here asks you to think about the different types of middle classes. Okay, so let's just now. Okay. So point one, the upper middle class, especially the businessmen, the big industrialists as we call it, initially supported the Nazis out of fear of communism, and they backed the Nazis because they knew the Nazis would crush the communists, as of course they did during the National Uprising. So we've covered that. They continued to support Hitler until the middle of the 1930s. No doubt about it, okay? Because Hitler delivered to them a disciplined workforce, okay? So 2nd of May 1933, remember, Hitler crushed the trade unions, okay? And he replaced the trade unions with the German Workers' Front, which was the Nazi workers' organisation that looked after the interests of the workers. But it didn't really look after the interests of the workers. It wasn't that interested really in giving them decent pay or working conditions, etc. It was primarily an instrument of control and of indoctrination of the workers in the values of the Nazi regime. Remember, Hitler and the Nazis never really trusted the working classes. We'll come on to the working classes in a minute anyway. But the if you're an employer, if you're a factory owner, if you own your own business, you've obviously got to pay the workers. And so the industrialists and the middle classes were generally grateful because that kind of like made it easier for them. The workers are not unionised and demanding more pay. Nice little quote from Lee there. Calls them the industrial barons. Okay. In the late 1930s, mobilisation for war, in other words, the focus from the late 1930s, obviously, right from the beginning in 1933, Hitler was intent on rearming Germany, breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, by stealth, as we said, persuading the Allies that his intentions were peaceful and getting them to agree that he could do that. But of course, he was really intent on war. Okay, mobilising the economy to fight this big war for living space in the East. Okay, and if it meant in the course of it having to go to war against France and Britain, so be it. Ultimately, his intention was to attack Russia. So in the late 1930s, mobilisation for war brought an even closer identity because the businessmen benefited financially with the Nazi plunder economy, in which the wealth of invaded countries was poured into the accounts of German industrialists that supported the 4-year plan. Now, we'll do this more when we do, in about 4 or 5 lessons' time, we're going to move into the Nazi economy and we'll develop this point. But that basically is what we're saying, is that bit by bit, Hitler absorbed other countries into the Reich, okay? And it began in 1938 with Austria. Now, he was able to absorb Austria into Germany without going to war, okay? And then later in 1938, he absorbed the Sudetenland part of Czechoslovakia into Germany, again, managed to avoid war. Okay, was able to do it through diplomatic channels that used the threat of war, but was able to do that. And these were vast territories that suddenly became part of Germany. And effectively, when we talk about a plunder economy, it means that the wealth of those territories was used as a kind of like a form of bait, a form of bribe in a sense, to the German businessmen, the big industrialists. It was like, if you follow the direction the regime is setting, which is to prepare for war. We want you to make weapons, not so much consumer goods, but we want our economy to be war-oriented. So we want you, the businessman. Okay, it's not communism. We're not taking you over. You can continue to be businessman, running your business for profit, and you can make yourself wealthy out of your business, but you've got to basically follow the direction of the regime, what the regime wants you to do. And if you do that, you will be rewarded by the wealth that will be plundered, seized, basically stolen from the occupied territories, and that certainly happened. So, for example, in Austria, there were a great many Austrian Jews, and their assets, their businesses were confiscated by Hitler and the Nazis, and much of that wealth was poured into the bank accounts of German industrialists as a reward for gearing their own businesses towards war preparation, towards the making of weapons. So in a sense, the Nazi economy was still a capitalist economy. If you were a businessman, you continue to own your business and make profit, but under state direction. And you had a choice, really. Either you cooperated with Hitler, in which case you would be rewarded, as I just said, through the plunder economy, or if you didn't cooperate, the chances are you wouldn't be able to survive as a business. So examples of big businesses that, in a sense, threw themselves wholeheartedly into this were Krupp and IG Farben, leading German businesses. They supported and profited, and when the war proper began in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, they continued to be complicit, to turn a blind eye, to accept that this was going to support their business as long as they followed Hitler. And of course, they did become complicit in Nazi war crimes. IG Farben, for example, manufactured the chemicals that were used in the death camps and the extermination camps in occupied Poland. during World War II. And for that, at the end of the war, they were put on trial. When the war ended and the regime was over and Hitler was dead, many of these industrialists were immediately put on trial by the Allies and served long, long prison sentences after the war because of their cooperation, their unholy alliance with Hitler. That's an example of a book about I.G. Farben. Yeah. The big industrial concern that worked with Hitler. So that's the upper middle classes. Now the bulk of the middle classes, the kind of Beamte, remember, the kind of professional types, teachers, etc., lawyers, and then the Mittelstand, they're the sort of like lower middle class, sort of like the people who run small businesses, maybe small shops and craft works, etc., in the countryside. And we've looked at these up to 1932. What about them? So, as you know, they were the big backers of the Nazis. The small businessmen in particular, very much, in the 1920s, were disillusioned with Weimar Germany, and they didn't just vote for the Nazis, but much of the core membership of these people joined the actual Nazi party. Okay, many, you look at the profile of the senior Nazis, people like Himmler. He was Mittelstand, a small chicken farmer. Okay, that sort of thing. So. The bulk of the middle classes, the sort of lower middle classes and professional types, on the whole, benefited greatly from new opportunities that resulted from Nazi rule. Okay, and they became a key element in the support of the regime. And this is what we call social mobility. Okay, so lower middle classes, if you think of our sort of social pyramid, if I just sort of zoom in a little bit, so we've drawn this sort of triangle before, our social pyramid. So at the bottom you've got the working classes, so I'll just put WC, working classes, but we're talking, and then you've got the upper middle class that we just talked about, the industrialists, but here we're talking about the great bulk in the middle. And what we're saying is that they benefited from the regime. It gave them status, it gave them influence, and that's what we mean by upward social mobility. They had never felt particularly valued in the Weimar Republic. That's why they tended to vote for the Nazis. Okay, but the Nazi regime was so into sort of controlling the population, they created these big mass organisations. I'll give an examples. They created the German Workers' Front, the DAF, okay, to control the workers. They created the SS as a police force to sort of control the population in general. They produced the Hitler Youth. So there was a massive different organisations, all of which were about control, and these organisations needed to be filled with people, with bureaucrats, office workers, and scientists. Many scientists worked for the SS because the SS were obsessed with racial theory, for example, and so opportunities for employment and having an important job, what was seen to be an important job for Hitler, suddenly appeared, which gave them a sense of status and importance. And that's what we're talking about here. And there was a very significant book written in the 1960s by an American historian, I think he was, called David Schönbaum, and there's the book there on the right, called Hitler's Social Revolution, Class and Status in Nazi Germany. And that book explored this theory, okay? And it was a very uncomfortable book. It made uncomfortable reading because clearly there'd been a very simplistic understanding in the first decade after World War II that the Nazi regime was implicitly evil and therefore everything that happened inside Nazi Germany must have been bad. But this almost suggested that actually the Nazi regime did create greater equality. People who'd been stuck at the bottom of the social pyramid now had opportunities to move upwards in society. And social mobility is generally seen to be a positive thing. Okay, it's about increasing people's status and confidence and giving them opportunities and employment, and that the Nazis were able to overcome many of those old divisions that we call class divisions, okay, and level things out and give people a sense of, hey, I'm important and I'm valued as much as the industrialists. Okay, so there was what we call social leveling that took place. It's not communism. Communism is redistribution of wealth. That's not the same. It still is a class society in which there are marked divisions of wealth. That never changed under Hitler's Germany, but nevertheless, people were proud, and this is what we're talking about. This. So, some middle classes, especially the small landowners and rural artisans, however, did not really benefit. And that's the point. It tended to be, the upward social mobility tended to be the middle classes that lived in the towns and the cities. Like, there's where the opportunities were. But those who lived in the countryside, in effect, during Hitler's rule, became marginalised. They became less important. And there's a big irony there, because in the rise to power, of course, it was the peasantry and the small farmers and the rural artisans who were the big backers of the Nazis. Okay, and Nazi blood and soil ideology always talked them up and said the best Germans were those who lived in the countryside. And we talked about that when we did about the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. But there was an irony here and an essential contradiction. These groups, the big backers of the Nazis in the 1920s, never really benefited from the economic recovery under Hitler. Why not? Because the economic recovery under Hitler prioritized the cities. Why did it prioritize the cities? Because the whole of the basis of Nazi economic recovery was about making weapons and preparing for war. And bottom line is, weapons are not made in small village craft shops. They're not made in fields. They're made in cities. So no matter how much the Nazis talked up blood and soil, that the best Germans were those who lived in the countryside, and these Germans had been taken in by that message and had supported Hitler, when it came to the reality, once Hitler was in power, they never really benefited from the Nazi regime. Okay. There was what we call the Entail Farm Law of 1933. It prevented the subdivision of large farms and imposed strict price controls on agricultural produce. Is a sort of classic example of how the countryside never really benefited. Hitler was intent on protecting the small farmers, but in the end, he needed to protect farms of a certain size because they were the most efficient in terms of feeding the German population, in terms of having economies of scale, because clearly the population needed to be fed. We'll do more about this when we do about the economy. And Hitler needed to impose strict price controls on agricultural produce, so farmers did not have the freedom just to put the prices up to themselves. And so, again, there was disillusionment in the countryside. Likewise, small businesses struggled, sort of small craft workers and etc., etc. Small shops even, okay? Bit like the small farmers, remember? They were passionate supporters of the Nazis in the rise to power when Hitler took power in 1933. Very much attracted by the fact that the Nazis were going to crush the communists, okay? So the Nazis delivered for them. But with the passage of time, the Nazi regime always prioritised the big businesses as the main driver of rearmament and preparation for war. And again, it's fairly obvious, if you want to have a tank made for war, you're not going to go to a small business to make a tank. You're going to go to a great big industrial concern like Thyssen or Krupp, whatever, to sort of like manufacture those sorts of things. Okay, so inevitably the small businessmen who had been the big backers of the Nazis tended to go, in the rise to power, tended to go to the wall. Their businesses simply couldn't survive. And again, if you think about it, that was sort of classic social Darwinism, which is Hitler's ideology, the survival of the fittest. That's the way in which he viewed life. So the small businessmen, therefore, could not compete with the big businessmen, because the big businessmen were getting the big government contracts. And when the small businessmen, their businesses went under, they looked for jobs, and they tended to get jobs working for the big Nazi organisations like the DAF and the Hitler Youth and the SS. And so these, what had been small businessmen, self-employed, often end up being employed as Nazi functionaries working for these massive Nazi institutions. White-collar workers is another interesting one. Remember, the white-collar workers, we've done whole lessons about the white-collar workers. They are the sort of like the office workers. You know, they wear the white collars. Okay, they're the teachers and the people who work in the civil service at the lower levels, educated middle classes. They did well. Okay, they proved to be responsive to the increased opportunities which accompanied economic revival. With economic revival and the growth of the Nazi economy and the massive manufacture of weapons, etc., new opportunities began to appear. So, as I say, for example, there were a great deal of investment in scientific research by the Nazis to support war preparation. All of the apparatus of control with the SS and the Gestapo and and mass control organisations like the DAF, they all needed bureaucrats, office workers, okay, to sort of push the paper around and sort of like manage this. And that, again, gave them jobs, a massive growing bureaucratic complex. Huge range of Nazi organisations created to mobilise, to get different sectors of the population moving to support the regime. And there's a nice little quote by Lee there that sort of captures it. And there's a diagram that sort of shows the organisation of the Nazi Party, okay, the NSDAP. So once Hitler took power in 1933, the Nazi Party became a huge apparatus with lots of what we call affiliated associations, lots of party organisations, and it worked both horizontally and vertically. Okay, so the vertical organisation began with Hitler at the top. Then you had the Deputy Führer, and then 18 what we call Reichsleiters. Okay, and also called the Gauleiters. Okay, so the Gauleiters, what we've talked about. And each of those Gauleiters, there's 18 of them, was the top Nazi in a particular region. This is why it's a vertical system. And then going down, each of those 18 regions, led by a Gauleiter, was divided into districts, 32 district leaders within each Gau. And then each of the 32 districts was divided into counties, and each of the counties was divided into etc., etc. And it went right down to the block leaders. Okay, and a block leader would literally be a block, a street, okay, or a cluster of streets in a town or a village, and there would be a Nazi called the block warden. Okay, and there were literally hundreds of thousands of these. So these all created jobs. That's the vertical system, and then you've got the horizontal organisations, which are shown here. So, for example, the SS. Okay, and these were not regional; these were just blanket across the whole of Germany, and the motorised corps, the NSKK, the HJ, the Hitler Youth. Okay, there's the DAF, the German Workers' Front. But each of those took a different sector of the population. There's what are the Nazi Teachers Association, okay, the Nazi Lawyers Association, and they again were massive organisations, and whatever sector of the workforce you work for, whether it is a lawyer or a teacher or a worker, or even a young person, Hitler Youth, or the students, there was a student organisation, you were expected to belong to that organisation. It was all part of the way in which Hitler controlled and indoctrinated and influenced the way the German people thought. So that's the horizontal, those organisations. So you've got horizontal and vertical. Because they're, by definition, organisations that created opportunities for white-collar workers. Okay, so a great deal of social mobility. If there's one particular social group that did really well under the Nazis, it tended to be the white-collar workers. Okay, there's quite a lot there on the middle classes. Okay, so we'll move on and let's go on to the working classes. So again, a lot of this is just recap because we've been revisiting these themes. So the working classes, the traditional view is that the working classes were the social group that from the beginning gave least support to the Nazis because their representative bodies, the Social Democrats, SPD, the KPD, the Communists, and the trade unions, were of course forcibly crushed by the regime in early 1933. Okay, that's the old view, the traditional view. However, recent research has shown that particularly in the early years, 1933 to 37, many workers, many working classes were genuinely won over. Nazi policies appeared to benefit them, not least the creation of jobs. Okay. However, from 1938 onwards, working classes' attitudes to the Nazi regimes increasingly turned negative again. So there's a sort of, obviously, a negativity at the start in 1933. The working classes had never really supported the Nazis, and then, of course, they lost their representation. But then a period in which it looked as if things were getting better. Okay, so not quite as simplistic as previously thought. There was a degree of support from the workers, but then 1938 it began to dip. All that sits beneath it, again, you just need to pick up some of the key points. So there's the old view: the workers remained more resistant. Okay, because of course they've lost their bargaining rights. Trade unions were crushed. Their wages were pegged at low levels by the Nazi regime. Clearly, we'll look at that when we do the economy, but if the workers are well paid, they want basically the shops to be filled with consumer goods so they've got something to spend their money on. If the shops, if there's a demand by the workers for consumer goods, then the German businesses will want to make goods to meet that demand, and they'll therefore want to make consumer goods. Hitler wants them to make weapons. So clearly you can't have the consumers driving the economy, so keep the workers' pay low. Okay, but at the same time he wants the workers to be happy. So how do you square the circle there if you can't actually pay them decent wages? So Hitler, it was all about these things here, which is the sort of point. Okay, so let's just go into that. So they've got low wages, they've got long working hours, because clearly Hitler wants rearmament, and is driven to sort of like have a massive drive for rearmament. He's not going to get that if workers are paid highly and work short hours. So clearly they didn't benefit. They benefited far less. Okay, so that argument still has much validity. Okay, we're not debunking it. We're not saying it's not there anymore. But recent research has shown that the vast majority of the working classes did in fact give what we call tacit support. To a degree, they supported the Nazis. They could see the underlying benefits. Okay, now much of that was because they responded very positively to Nazi propaganda, which played up their importance, made them feel good. Okay, working class patriotism, and in particular, sort of these massive organisations, and the key one is that one there, the German Labour Front. Okay, and it had subsidiary organisations, Strength Through Joy and Beauty of Labour, but it projected an image that the bosses and the workers were working in harmony, that Germans were united by their nationality. Okay, now that was of course far from the truth. The regime always backed the bosses first, as we've already said. But nevertheless, the perception that was put across through this incredible propaganda machine led by Joseph Goebbels was a part of the reality, how they perceived themselves. And because they were bombarded by images and about the fact that you are happy, to some extent it did work to a degree. And these organisations, such as the German Workers' Front and its subsidiaries, the Strength to Joy and Beauty of Labour, although workers weren't paid a lot, they did compensate because they did do things like theatre trips, package holidays, they improved the amenities in the workplace, swimming pools, factories, etc. So it appeared to the workers to a point that their life had improved. And certainly in contrast to the Great Depression of 1929 to 32, when Hitler came to power, 33, certainly for the first 4 or 5 years, it felt like there was a positive move. Okay, So Nazi propaganda credited workers with the economic recovery of the mid-1930s. It made workers feel valued. But the point, as I just said there, it worked to a point because their point of comparison was the dark years of the Great Depression. But as the years of the Great Depression receded into the past, inevitably workers would forget that. And so by the late 1930s, working classes' attitude began to become more negative again. And the reason they became more negative is by the late 1930s, there were increased pressures imposed on the workers because by that point, the German economy was very, very much focused on war preparation. Okay, and we'll do this in the series of lessons where we look at the Nazi economy. So wages, by the late 1930s, it was clear that their wages were not going to go up. They were working long hours, lack of consumer goods. Now, in the early 1930s, to some extent, the workers accepted the fact that their wages needed to be low because it was all about, we've got to create jobs, we've got to sort out the problems of the Great Depression, get the country working again. And there was a sense of, yes, we've got to accept these sort of sacrifices, back Hitler, to get the economy going again. But by 1936, there was pretty much full employment. And so from that point onwards, workers were saying, well, we should be paid more, okay, because there's no unemployed out there. We're valuable and we should be paid more. But Hitler was not prepared to pay them more because he wanted basically to pour the wealth of the economy into making of weapons. So by 1937-38, there was definitely a sort of resistance, a sullen resentment that Hitler was not turning out to be what he had promised to be. So low workers' morale by 1938-39, and that may have been a factor why Hitler chose to risk war by invading Poland in 1939. In a sense, a little bit like what happened in 1914. Remember the Kaiser could sense the working class unhappiness, the growth of the SPD had got 110 seats in the Reichstag, and in a sense, going to war in 1914 kind of distracted the workers from their problems. And there's an argument put forward by some key British historians, in particular a historian called a man called Tim Mason, who's argued quite persuasively that one of the factors as to why Hitler went to war earlier than expected in 1939, in a sense, was to take the pressure off the workers, and that a short victorious war against Poland would bring the workers, boost the morale of the workers, make them feel good again, and it would also boost Hitler's popularity. Okay, so there's the working classes. 3 more, the women, armed churches, women in a nutshell. So we've done a series where we did one lesson about the women. Okay, so we've covered it up to 1932. Now the traditional view is that women resented the regime because it took away the amazing freedoms they had gained in the Weimar era. So again, you may want to just backtrack to previous notes about women in the Weimar era. Remember, they were given the vote, very, very liberated era in some ways, opportunities in the workplace, in politics, etc. But much recent research shows a more complex picture in which many women actively supported the Nazi regime in spite of losing their freedoms. And again, you may remember, hopefully you remember from that previous lesson about women, we actually pointed out how the German women were very divided in the 1920s. There was definitely a sector of women who benefited from the Weimar Republic, gave them opportunities for employment, and different social status. They could go into the bars and nightclubs in Berlin and live a very liberal and free lifestyle. But that, in a sense, created a backlash amongst more conservative women who didn't like that. They felt that the Weimar Republic had sullied, had damaged the status, the position of women, and that they didn't like the new opportunities that were appearing. So German women were very divided in the years before Hitler took power. And in a sense, when Hitler took power, he sided with the latter group. He very clearly said, women's place is not to be going into Berlin and living in clubs and being active in the realm of politics and employment and things like that. Their role should be in the home. And ironically, the Nazi regime had a great deal of support for that. Okay, so let's have a look at the detail there. So the old view is that women were forced into compliance by the Nazi regime. Okay, that women had this great freedom in the Weimar era, and they were forced back into the home. All those liberated years were gone, and that women therefore must have hated Hitler. Okay, sullen, sort of likely, just sort of did what they were told. But in a sense, that's kind of like imposing our own values of the 21st century onto the women of the time. And more recent historiography has emphasised the picture was much more complex. Again, we've got to avoid talking in superlatives. It's not that black or white. Okay, and that's the point. You've got to recognise the nuances. It was certainly the case that many women did resent their removal from. They'd worked hard in the Weimar Republic. They'd got jobs working in law and even politics, and they were now forced out of their jobs to become mothers. Okay, get into the home with all these sorts of sort of benefits and enticements, the marriage loan scheme and the motherhood cross, things that you would have done at GCSE history, those sorts of things. But again, a bit like the working classes, we can actually see that Nazi propaganda worked to a large extent. It actually did make women feel good. The emphasis on the importance of the family and home and the central role of women. And those sorts of positive feelings were reinforced, again, a bit like the workers, by there was improved provision for them. So in the same way as the German Workers' Front was created for the workers, and it gave them swimming pools in the factories, it gave them package holidays and trips to the theatres, and they hadn't had those things in the 1920s. Same with the women, okay, that although organisations such as the Frauenwörter were largely created as instruments of control and of propaganda to effectively indoctrinate women into Nazi values, they did provide maternity schemes, family benefits, financial assistance, visits from welfare workers and nurses, etc. There was improved provision. And again, it's an uncomfortable thing here to talk about, and this is what Schoenbaum did and why his book was so important, because it's almost like saying, as historians, we can't become blinkered and just take the automatic position can't just be that everything the Nazis did was bad and wrong, that they did do things that were effective and that did improve the lives of people, okay? As long as you were the right sorts of people. Yes, absolutely. I mean, you can see the sort of propaganda image there. They're all sort of like blonde, Aryan, white women. And we'll do more on the sort of the social groups that were absolutely outside the community. They benefited in no way at all. But if you were a good, loyal German and you backed Hitler and you were of the right racial type and you had the correct social attitudes, there was definitely improved provision for you, and that was certainly true with women. Nazi regime created many opportunities to actively contribute. So that's again in sort of new view. it's a bit simplistic to say that they were all in the home and they all had to leave their jobs that they had in the 1920s. Yes, that was true to a point, but these new organisations that were created for them, such as the NS Frauenschaft, which was a huge organisation, there's a picture there, and the various welfare organisations created opportunities for employment. Okay, especially the case for women with few qualifications who wanted to be involved in political activism. By 1935, 11 million out of Germany's 35 million females belonged to the National Socialist Frauenschaft, the Nazi women's movement. Okay, and there were also some Nazi feminists who supported most Nazi ideals. Because let's face it, Nazi ideology said the women's place is in the home having children to make the Reich a stronger Reich. But the ideology, it didn't say that women were second class, it simply said they were different from men. The role of men was to be in the public sphere, in politics and employment, and the role of women was more in the private and domestic. But within that, the Nazi regime sort of talked them up as being superior to being men. Okay, they were as strong as men in their own separate sphere. Okay, so there were some Nazi feminists who actively supported Nazi ideals, and some even dared challenge the party line by arguing that women should not be removed from the professions. There's a woman there, Sophie Roger-Byrne, as an example of that. So there were always exceptions that we just aware of. Avoid writing in sort of like superlatives, simplistic ways. Okay. Next, the army. So again, we don't need to spend long on the army because we've covered this in whole lessons in the past. So the traditional view is that the Great Prussian Army, which had played such an important part putting Hitler into power, was largely compliant, backed the Nazis, served their interests, okay, because they put Hitler into power. And then the traditional view is from the late 1930s, as war approached, many army officers began to regret the support they had given to Hitler. Okay. Now, more recent research has it's not really challenged that view. That view is still very much there, but it has shown it's more nuanced. It's in particular focused on the SS, and in particular how the SS had its own section called the Waffen-SS. And we talked about that in a previous lesson. There was a subsection of the SS that were the militarized divisions of the SS. Now, the SS started off basically by being the German police force. But in the long term, Hitler wanted the SS to take over everything, including becoming the new German army. And so there was a section within the SS called the Waffen-SS. And although they were small and barely noticeable in the 1930s, once World War II began, the SS became increasingly important, the Waffen-SS, increasingly infiltrated and started to take over the army. Especially in the latter stages of World War II, the Waffen-SS. So that's again something to be aware of. The notes, much of this we've already covered. Traditional view is the German army, complicit in putting Hitler in power, largely dominated by and subservient to the Nazi political system. To a large extent, the traditional view is still valid, so the bulk of the army was systematically taken over. There's the oath of loyalty we've already talked about. The army was grateful to Hitler for the Night of the Long Knives. We've done that. They supported Hitler's claim to the presidency. They swore that oath of allegiance. So, in a sense, hoodwinked and pulled into the Nazi regime. And of course, Hitler's early foreign policy was so astonishingly successful, rebuilding the strength of the German army, rearming Germany, and apparently getting away with all this without having to go to war. The Austria with Anschluss and the Sudetenland was incorporated into Germany. Hitler was building up national pride, so the army sort of like very much pulled along by this sort of like revived nationalism that Hitler had brought about. But gradually they were being, again, pulled in. So in various ways, the adoption of the swastika on their uniforms, and a subtle, long process of indoctrination, because by 1938, 1939, many of the younger soldiers and in particular the younger army officers, had gone through Nazi education schemes. They'd gone through the Hitler Youth, they'd gone through Nazi schooling since 1933. And so it was almost impossible by the time war broke out in 1939 to say the army was completely separate from Nazism. Nazism was starting to creep in, the values of Nazism, into the army, and particularly at the lower levels, sort of making, and that's a subtlety that historians now understand. And then, of course, during World War II, the SS, who we traditionally think of as Germany's police, they did have their Waffen-SS divisions that fought alongside the regular German army in combat during World War II. And increasingly, the boundaries of the non-Nazi soldiers, the Prussian regiments and the SS regiments, became blurred because they fought alongside each other in the fighting. The old view was that it was the SS soldiers who committed all the atrocities in the occupied territories, the mass shootings of Jews behind the lines during the invasion of Russia, for example, the manning of the concentration camps in Poland. But more recent research has shown that it wasn't that simplistic, that Prussian soldiers who were not members of the Nazi Party were complicit in much of the violence against the Jews in the occupied territories during World War II. The historian Bartov has even shown that members of the working class were transformed into brutal, fanatic soldiers. We tend to sort of view the army as being very much an upper class organisation, but with mass conscription, ordinary German workers were brought into the army, and the vast majority of them didn't really want to be conscripted, but Bartov has shown that many working classes were transformed and they were brought into the whole Nazi way of thinking, which is the point there. The historian Bonert has shown that after the Night of the Long Knives, large numbers of retired army officers also joined the SS. That's all, again, part of the blurring between the traditional Prussian army and the Nazi organisations. And that's the sort of the subtlety that we're now aware of as this. Okay, so we're building up the picture now. One branch left to do, the churches, finish off. So religious groups, in a nutshell. Religious groups is sort of like a very, very simplistic topic at GCSE. The textbooks are not very good on religious groups. There's been a lot of great research into the religious groups, and I think that one of the key things here is that Hitler never really got to grips with religion. He almost put it on the back burner. It was never a massive problem for him, but at the same time, the priests and the pastors, because remember there's two churches in Germany, there's the Catholic churches, but then there's the Protestant churches. He never was really able to fully take control over it. People at heart are going to have a faith, and they want to go to church on Sunday. And when they're in church on Sunday, that's something where they're not really going to listen to politics. They're going to listen to a priest or a pastor talk about a higher power than Hitler, and that higher power, of course, is God. And that made Hitler, of course, deeply uncomfortable, because what he wants is German people to be fully loyal to him and not to a higher authority, God. But how do you deal with that? So this is what this is about. Now, to some extent, Hitler was helped because both the Catholic and the Protestant churches cautiously welcomed Hitler taking power. Okay, and in particular, one of the reasons for that, if you think about it, is the church is a big landowner. The church owns property, and with the rise of communism, if the communists had taken power, the wealth of the rich would have been redistributed amongst ordinary people, and that would have really impacted on the church. They would have lost their wealth. Marxism, true Marxism as well, is atheistic. So to some extent, both churches, the Catholic and Protestant, sort of like cautiously welcomed Hitler because, and in particular, the way in which he crushed communism. Nazism was seen to be a movement that was there to protect property, to protect the middle classes, and that included, of course, the church, because the church was a big property owner. Okay, and in particular, the Protestant Church. One of the big factors is a bit like our Church of England. Our Church of England is a Protestant church, well, the clue is there. The Protestant Church was the Church of Germany. Okay, so the Protestant Church was a very nationalistic organisation, a bit in the sense that the way our Church of England is a strong sense of patriotism and respect for the monarch, etc. So in a similar way, in 1933, the German Protestant Church tended to be fairly nationalistic, not in a bad way, but in a sort of good way, proud to be German, etc., etc. And so, because the Nazis were a strongly nationalistic movement, it meant that if Hitler played it properly with them, they would continue to support the Nazi regime. But there were significant exceptions. The Catholic Church was more problematic. They recognised the benefits of communism being crushed, but they very, very quickly regretted their decision to support Hitler. Hitler made a deal with them called the Concordat in 1933, which they very quickly regretted. But they struggled to form an effective voice against the regime. They constantly spoke out. And of course, one of the problems about the Catholic Church is Catholic Church headquarters is abroad. It's in Italy, and Hitler had no direct control over the Vatican, unlike the German Protestant Church, which was a church of Germany. So it was more easily brought under Nazi control. So again, the details there. Just quickly to go through them. Both the Catholic and Protestant churches in Germany had disliked the Weimar years. That was a factor on Hitler's side. Remember the Weimar era, typical sort of like picture of a Berlin nightclub, and very liberated, huge break from the past. This astonishing social experiment, Germany between 1919 and 1932. But the Christian churches, of course, were shocked by these sorts of images. This is a famous film called The Blue Angel, with a German actress who's there on the left. They're called Marlene Dietrich, and the churches associated the Weimar era with a decline in spiritual values. So when Hitler came along in 1933 and took power, and he, of course, promised a return to traditional values and will crush communism and restore traditional values, it was very appealing. Okay. They also accused the Weimar Republic of fostering a threat from the godless left wing. So that's this sort of like the Weimar Republic had seen communism thrive. Socialist organisations were Marxist, and of course Marxist was atheistic, basically rejected religion and God. And of course, Marxism also promised to confiscate the wealth of the churches and redistribute it to the workers. So there were lots of reasons as to why the churches should cautiously welcome the Nazi regime, but emphasis on the word cautious. Why should they be cautious? It's fundamental, it's fairly obvious, I hope. The Nazi regime was social Darwinistic. Okay, the fundamental ideology of the Nazi regime was the survival of the fittest. The weak go under, the strong are promoted. It's a ruthless world, it's the law of the jungle out there. That's what drove Nazi ideology. Well, that is completely contrary to everything that the Christian churches believe in. The Christian churches believe in the exact opposite. They believe that the weak should not go under, that it's the responsibility of Christians to support the weak, to help the weak, protect the weak. And so that's why there was a huge note of caution in all the churches. Cautiously they welcomed the regime because the regime would restore order and restore traditional values and crush communism. But clearly there was going to be a tension there. Now Hitler, of course, played on this. We know that Hitler was absolutely great at pretending to be something different from what he was, and because he did it superbly in 1923. His first speech, the appeal to the German nation, on the 1st of February 1933, 5 times in that speech he mentioned Christianity and played at the Nazi movement as if it was a Christian movement. On the 23rd of March, when he gave the speech for the Enabling Act, Hitler claimed that Christianity was the unshakable foundation of the moral and ethical life of our people. And of course, Hitler just had an eye on the vote. He wanted the Catholic Centre Party to vote for the Enabling Act. Okay, so just because Hitler said things doesn't mean that he actually meant those things. So what do you need to know if you're going to talk about sort of like the religious aspects of this? And again, you could bring this in. This is useful for section B as well, the depth study, 1933 to 35, which is the takeover of power. There's lots of opportunities within the questions in the depth study where you could talk about the religious aspects. So it is important to sort of break it into two, the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, and just be aware of the different approaches. So first of all, relations with the Catholic Church. We know the Centre Party voted for the Enabling Act, the Catholic Centre Party. Okay, they'd voted. If they'd voted against it, it wouldn't have been passed. Okay, Centre Party members convinced themselves that Hitler was acting in the interests of the German Catholics. Okay, crushing communism, restoring law and order, strong leadership. And so Hitler continued to play that along, and on the 20th of July 1933, he, playing along that Catholic support for the regime, he signed the famous Concordat with the papacy. It was his first foreign treaty, and it was with the Vatican. Okay, and it's called the Concordat, and the date 20th of July 1933. Again, you need to enshrine that one in your memory. And by this agreement, it was a two-way agreement. Both sides made promises. Hitler promised that Catholics were free to worship. He said the Nazi regime will not interfere. Catholics can go to church every Sunday, say Mass, listen to the priest in the pulpit, and the Nazis will keep out of it. Okay, so fit that into the context of this is all part of Hitler bringing to a halt the revolution and saying now it's going to be evolution. Okay, Hitler saying Nazis do not want to take over everything. Okay, now of course we know that in the long term Hitler did want to take over the church, but he didn't know how to do this, so he just basically made this what we can now see as a false promise. He said, I'm not going to interfere, you can carry on. And the papacy was taken in by that. They promised in return that German Catholics would stay out of politics, that the German Catholics would be loyal to the new Nazi state. They agreed that the Catholic trade unions would now be dismantled. And they agreed that the clergy would not participate in political activity. So all priests in Germany were instructed, when you give your sermons, your homilies every Sunday from the pulpit, you are not to comment on political matters. We stay out of it. Sorry, the video just switched off there. Hopefully I haven't lost everything from that I've done so far here. I think it's okay. Sorry, the video just switched off there. Hopefully I haven't lost everything that I've done so far here. I think it's okay. The next page, that's where it went off. Okay, so easier in a sense with the Protestant Church because it was a nationalistic church. Okay, so Protestants had distrusted the Weimar Republic because of the. So I just need to change my pen back now. Everything's defaulted to an old setting. Had distrusted the Weimar Republic because of the Catholic influence exercised through the Centre Party in the Reichstag. It was a national church. As a consequence, patriotism was rooted in its attitudes. So they admired Hitler for its patriotism. So as a result, tended to support right-wing parties in the early 1930s, such as the DVP and the DMVP. And they were, of course, the political parties that worked in Hitler's first coalition. They were his first coalition in the early 1930s. Now, many Protestants, therefore, found the switch from the Weimar Republic to the Nazi regime relatively easy. They welcomed the new regime. They mistook it for Hitler re-establishing good old law and order and traditional authorities. So in July 1933, the Protestant structure was taken over as part of the process of Gleichschaltung. Hitler created 28 provincial Protestant churches, or he didn't create them. 28 provincial Protestant churches were unified into a single Reich church under a Nazi Reich bishop called Ludwig Müller. And also Hitler created a minister of church affairs in 1935 called Hans Kerl. So to some extent, Gleichschaltung was completed with regards to the Protestant Church. Unlike the Catholic Church, where there was never really a takeover, with the Protestant Church, arguably there was. A unified Protestant Church was created. And also, to some extent, at the grassroots level, at the lower levels of the church, there was what were called the German Christians, a sort of like a radical. They're often called the SA of Jesus Christ. They'd been there before 1933, and they were sort of like a radical Christian sect who latched onto views that Jesus Christ was an Aryan and so on and so forth. And they began to infiltrate the Protestant church at the lower level. But that, in a sense, caused problems because although the Protestant church, the pastors in the Protestant church backed Nazism to a point, and this unified Protestant church, but they also resisted the attempt by these sort of radical German Christians to sort of infiltrate the Protestant church. So there was a lot of internal disunity within the Protestant church that Hitler was never really able to get to grips with. Okay, and so with the passage of time, many Protestant clergy began to speak out against Nazi policies, in particular against these radical German Christians. So, for example, Pastor Martin Niemöller spoke out against the formation of this ministry of churches, said that was wrong. And Pastor Martin Niemöller actually formed an emergency league of about 2,000 pastors. Pastor is a Protestant priest, who formed what was called the confessional church, like a breakaway Protestant church that would refuse to follow the Nazi movement. And Hitler dealt with them by simply having them arrested and sent to concentration. So both Catholic and Protestant churches did cause problems for the regime, but not significant problems, but nevertheless it was an issue that Hitler, in a sense, put on the back burner, and then war broke out. And we know from Hitler's conversations that if the war had been won, which of course it wasn't, one of Hitler's big priorities after the war would have been to sort of like fully target the Catholic and Protestant churches and bring about a full coordination of religion. That's it. I'm going to stop there. Hopefully the device switching off hasn't completely messed up this recording. I don't want to have to do it all again. I don't think I will. I will stop there and upload this to YouTube. And again, as always, any queries, any questions, message me in chat. Make sure that with this assignment, this lesson is an assignment, you just simply click on turn in Teams, so I know that you've coped with it and that you've done the mind mapping and you understand it all. But if there's any queries, send me a message using chat in Teams. Thank you very much. I'll sign off now.